Hi, my name is Eva Feldman. I'm a professor of neurology and director of the Neural Network for Emerging Therapies. I'm really thrilled to have with me today Professor Ravi Allada. Dr. Allada is currently the Raphael Collegiate Professor of Neuroscience. He's a professor in our Department of Anesthesiology at Michigan Medicine, and really importantly, he is the new director of the Michigan Neuroscience Institute. So welcome. I'm really thrilled you're here today.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to kind of share my vision of the Institute and tell you a little bit about myself.
Yes, so let's start with a little bit about yourself. I know you're a U of M MD grad, so go blue. But
Yes.
tell us a little bit about your connection with Michigan.
Yeah.
And where you came to us from, too.
Yes. So it's maybe no joke to say that I bleed maize and blue.
Oh, good.
I'm a native Michigander. Was born in Midland, Michigan, about 100
Okay.
miles north of Ann Arbor. I attended my undergraduate here at Michigan.
Oh, I didn't know
and
that,
medical
really.
school, got my
Fabulous.
medical degree. Both of my brothers also did their undergraduate work here, as well as got their medical degrees as well.
All three.
All three of us did, yes.
Well, that's a trifecta in my
Yes,
family.
indeed. My daughter's currently an undergraduate here. She's doing computer science. My wife also attended Michigan for undergrad and for grad school.
Wow.
And on top of that, I've married into a family that has had football season tickets for the last 40 years, so I'm very much engaged
That was
with,
part of her dowry, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, it sealed the deal, so to speak. So I have a lot of connections with Michigan. It does feel like home since I've come back. As you alluded to, when I eventually started my own research lab, I started at Northwestern, where I'd been for about 23 years before I accepted this job at Michigan.
I had the privilege of attending a seminar that you gave when you were looking at potentially joining us
Right.
as our new director. And it was on sleep.
Uh-huh.
I remember that, circadian rhythms, and I remember going home and thinking, if you don't sleep more, Eva, you're going to develop dementia.
Yes.
And I thought, I got to do better. So could you tell me a little bit about your program? I think we'd really all like to know more about your research and then probably some of the, translational aspects of it too.
Sure. Yeah, the joke I like to tell about my research is it keeps me up at night, and it,
That's a good one.
and it also gets me out of bed in the morning. So, and it's really the question of why do we sleep? I mean, it's just something I've been thinking about for a very long time, we go into this state, all of us experience, of going into this kind of, that at least superficially resembles being in a coma. You're unresponsive, you're not moving around, you spend a third of your lives doing it. We know from a lot of studies now that if you don't sleep, as you mentioned, you're at risk of a lot of diseases, and that can be, depression, it could be Alzheimer's disease, it could be even diseases that we don't normally think of as of the brain, like diabetes and obesity.
Right.
And so we have a pretty good idea, for other basic drives, like why do we breathe or why do we eat? We don't have the same understanding of why do we sleep. And so that's really what, we've been trying to address
And
at a fundamental
so
level.
I know that, there's some really interesting research about sleep and circadian rhythms, light, and also then how that affects metabolism, brain health. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And is your research, does it address any of those questions?
Sure. We've been, so one of the things people should understand is, and many people do, is that when we talk about sleep, there's really two sort of fundamental aspects of sleep.
I think you should explain that to us.
Yeah. So there's one aspect that we call the homeostatic aspect, of drive to sleep. And that's really the one that says you need to sleep, and you need to sleep a certain amount. You experience this if you, for example, pull an all-nighter or don't sleep very well. The next day you feel super tired and very sleepy.
Right.
And then there's, in addition to that homeostatic component, there's also what we call a circadian component. Circadian meaning about a day. And really what
Okay.
the circadian, it's an internal biological clock.
Okay.
And really what that clock does is it acts kind of like an internal alarm clock. It says it's about, morning for us, and it's time to wake up. So, if I put you in a cave, you'd still wake up at about the same time, even if you don't see the sun, or you're not just responding to your environment. You have this internal circadian clock. And what our research showed, and again, we actually do some work on fruit flies in this work.
Do you really?
Yes.
Oh, fabulous.
Yes. And what we found is that you can think of that homeostat as almost like the thermostat in your house, where it has a set point, and it heats up your house and it keeps it at a constant level. So that's kind of a homeostatic system that I think many of us would have like a personal experience with. And what we showed is that the circadian clock basically programs that homeostat. It dials it up to keep you awake, like you're heating up your house, and then at night it dials the homeostat down to let you fall asleep. And that's some of the fundamental work that we've done.
And it's true, am I right, that body temperature changes?
Yes, that's also true.
And that's part of this.
Absolutely. For reasons we don't fully understand, that when you go to sleep, your body temperature falls, and you might personally experience this in that some people start to sweat, right? Your sweating reaction when you're asleep is your body trying to cool itself off, trying to drop its body temperature.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there's all sorts of products now. I don't know if there's so many sleep products out there, but there's all sorts of products about cool pillows or, cool sheets that kind of help you cool down, that we hope would make us sleep better.
So your own research, what do you think is the most pivotal, critical finding you've had that could be applied to an everyday life, my everyday life?
Well, I think we've demonstrated that the circadian clock can, that there are fundamental mechanisms by which the clock ultimately controls your sleep state. And we've discovered those key mechanisms within neurons that function through coordination of specific ion channels. And really what that does is...
In specific areas of the brain,
yes,
I'm assuming.
Like the not to get too technical, but in the hypothalamus that's kind of behind your optic nerve, the suprachiasmatic nucleus it's called. And you can basically, this thing is driving sleep. And so you may experience this drive, for example, when you travel across many time zones, because your circadian clock continues to run at the same time.
I see.
But of course, when you travel from, say, Detroit to Europe, the sun is coming up at a totally different time. The meals are happening at a totally different time. And so, your body will still try to drive you to fall asleep at that particular time because of this clock function.
So I'm frequently asked, and don't know the answer, but I'm sure you will. Can you now connect the sun to all of this? Because I have patients who say, should I buy sunlight? Should I go under sunlight for an hour? Will that help reset my circadian clock? And should I bring a sunlight to Europe?
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about how the sun is connected to the work you're doing?
Sure. So the best way, so when I said the clock is circadian, circa actually means near 24 hours. So left to your own devices, you would not wake up and sleep every 24 hours exactly.
Okay.
What you need is a little bit of the sun to tell it to reset that clock so that you always wake up at roughly the same time of day. The problem, so talk about your friend who's going to Europe, or even if I'm going to Europe.
Right.
And the irony of all this is sometimes we have meetings in Europe, and so we're all of the biological clock researchers are jet lagged. We don't have the answer. We don't have the answer yet. Shh, don't tell anyone. But it is important to get light. The problem is that obviously we didn't evolve to travel across time zones.
Right.
So our system is super stable, and so our ability to shift is quite limited. Will light help? Absolutely. So if you're in a different time zone or different country, whatever, you traveled across time zones, get outside. Get the sunlight. That's your best bet. If you were to think about sunlight as a drug, right? The amount you get from the sun by being outside dwarfs, or is much larger than, dwarfs the thing you get from a sunlight thing you would buy at the store.
Okay.
Like the number of photons you would get
Okay.
experience from that, the intensity of the light. So getting more light is going to be better. Of course, more light for longer is also better. But just be aware that your ability to shift is quite limited. And so the general rule of thumb that we use is, let's say you travel across 5 time zones.
Right.
It's going to take you 5 days to really adjust.
And then your clock resets,
yes,
though.
it does.
Can reset.
It does
That's
reset.
interesting.
Slowly but surely resets, yes.
So let me ask another question that I think our listeners would be interested in, and I am.
Sure.
What about, we do have individuals who work night shifts, like work, I would say, like 8 to 8, 8 p.m. to 8
That's right.
a.m., and then come and usually then try to sleep, get up
Yes.
and do that. Do they then reset their clock to that, I would say, different sort of life? And then if they
Yeah.
have a normal day, what happens to them? And does your research address any of that in terms of, like, what does the clock do?
Right, right. So first off, I think there's just too many social cues. Like
Yes.
there's too much of life is scheduled on the, whatever, call it the typical
Yes.
human schedule, being awake in the day and being asleep at night. So if you have any social connections and you want to interact with other people in your life, it's really, really hard. And so shift workers really suffer the consequences of having a mismatch between their light exposure when they're awake and what their internal circadian clock is doing.
I see.
We also experience that mismatch when we travel across time zones. That's when, our clock is still in Chicago or Detroit. Sorry, maybe I'm still in Chicago.
No, you're here with us. and
I'm
you're
here in
gonna
Ann Arbor.
stay,
I'm
and
here
you're
in Ann Arbor.
staying.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And then, but if you're in Germany or something, you're living on the German schedule, but your clock you left back at your house, in Ann Arbor. So, and it's moving very slowly to catch up with you over time. If you think about it that way. One of the studies that we did that's sort of pertinent to that is we actually looked at the impact of this mismatch in the context of Major League Baseball.
Oh,
So
wow.
one of the things I was interested in, my background is like very basic neuroscience, genetics, but I've also trained as a clinical pathologist in terms of my medical training. And so I was always interested in how can we apply this work to human beings? And at the same time, I've always been a huge sports fan from my childhood. And I love baseball, and there's a ton of statistics in baseball. So I thought, we know all the travel schedules because we know the schedule of the games,
I know where you're
and we can measure a ton of numbers. Any baseball fan knows there's a bazillion numbers you can measure. So there's a lot of data. And so I thought, why don't we look at the travel, like how many time zones they travel, that's the amount of jet lag,
Yeah.
and then look at the impact on all these performance metrics. Long story short, we found that when pitchers travel east, and that could be they could be traveling home, back to their home stadium, or they'd be traveling on the road, they give up more home runs.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And it was we found it was replicable. It was the strongest effect we found. It was consistent. Now, interesting. Now, some of you may say, well, maybe it was just traveling. How do we know it's not just traveling? Well, I talked to you a little bit about this circadian, about
Right,
24. It
right.
turns out, for most people, our circadian period is actually longer than 24 hours. What does that mean? That means if we want to go west, it's going to be much easier. We're just sleeping in, right?
Right.
We just sleep in another hour when we go out to the west coast, or a couple hours when we go to
Right.
the west coast, right? When we go east, it's much harder. And so
Yes.
these effects that I talked about, these effects of jet lag on
Right.
giving up home runs, only happen when the pitchers go east. When they go west, they didn't see the same effect. And to bring it even closer to us, we experience this every year for daylight savings time,
Oh,
right? So when
yes.
we spring forward, thankfully not to fall back, but when we spring forward, we lose that. It's almost like we traveled east just 1 hour. And you may think that's not going to have a major impact, but now there's lots of studies showing a lot of medical impact, like
Yes.
visits to the ER,
Yes.
traffic accidents,
Yes.
and all these things go up significantly, like that first Monday after they do the
Right.
spring forward. So just be aware, and there's a lot of movement legislatively in different states about getting rid of that, falling back and springing forward.
Yes,
to
in
kind
fact, we have one neurologist in my department who's been very vocal, a sleep neurologist,
Yes.
for that because she really truly espouses everything
Yes.
you've just said.
Yes, yes.
So tell me some of the interesting things you've seen in the Michigan neuroscience community and what has really sparked your interest.
Yeah, one of the things when I met with people, I approached the meetings as, hey, what can I do to help you? What can I do to make your, research program or, more exciting, more interesting? What's holding you back?
Right.
Because I'm here to help. And we get through that in like 5 or 10 minutes, and people turn it around and say, like, how can I help you? And so getting that kind of feedback it's tremendous, and I really feel like there's just going to be so many opportunities.
So that probably leads me to a natural next question,
Okay.
and that if you had to articulate then your vision for the Michigan Neuroscience Institute, like what is your vision? And if you sat here a year from now, what would have been your metric of success?
That's a
what
great
would you have
question.
said, ooh, I'm successful as the new director because this has occurred. So what's your vision, and like where do you see yourself a year from now? What's the metric of success
Yeah.
for this new institute
Great.
that we're all so excited about?
Well, let me try to take that on in like 2 parts.
Yes, definitely.
Certainly, like I can talk about sort of the overall vision.
Yeah, I would like to hear that. I think we all would.
But I'm a very metrics person, so I've been thinking about that question quite a bit. But so in terms of like overall vision, what I really see the Institute trying to do is what I like to say is create an inclusive and diverse community. And I mean that in like many different dimensions. I think bringing together people who do many different types of research, many different types of work and science, bringing them together in a way that you remove the barriers to interactions. Secondly, I think we want to build the best interdisciplinary research teams, whether that's through recruitment of new faculty, whether that's through, for example, like we're contemplating things like challenge grants. And we really want not just to bring teams together to bring teams together, we're going to bring teams together to solve big problems. Many of those problems, many of those diseases, many of those mysteries of the brain that we talked about earlier. Let's put it out there. Let's say, hey, how can we address a big problem like Alzheimer's disease? How could we bring together the different tools? And how can we bring together people who may not even know that their work is relevant to neuroscience?
Yes.
Like there may be somebody in computer science who isn't really thinking about this problem.
Right.
How do we bring those people in?
I agree
right?
completely.
And then the third pillar, if you will, of my vision is really building the research infrastructure, whether that's the next generation of trainees, whether that's the next technologies that we're going to need to really get at that resolution that I talked about earlier. And then lastly, it's really, I think Michigan is already great in neuroscience. How do we elevate our visibility? How do we make ourselves known both internally but also externally to, again, a diverse audience, whether it's other scientists, but even the public? How do we communicate that to what we're doing here at Michigan?
I'm really excited you've joined us
Yes.
at Michigan Medicine / University of Michigan. And I think you're going to have a great time here. Everyone's very excited about your arrival. So welcome again, and come see me on your learning and listening tour.
I would love to do that.
Perfect. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Well, I want to again thank the panelists now for joining me for a Q&A. Dr. Allada and I are joined now by Dr. Cathy Goldstein, who's a professor of neurology, one of our sleep specialists here at Michigan Medicine, one of actually the most renowned and expert. And she's also vice chair of innovation in the Department of Neurology. So welcome. I tell you, as usual, we have many questions. This time I counted them while I was rewatching our interview. Dr. Allada, we have 42 questions.
Oh.
So we aren't going to make them all, but we may stay a few minutes over our usual 10-minute Q&A, and I hope our participants can stay if they're interested. So Dr. Goldstein, I'll start with you. So this is an interesting one. If I wake up at 1 a.m. and can't return to sleep, and this is from an adult, what are the best strategies? Is it all right to get up and work for an hour, watch a show on TV? What should I do to help me get back to sleep? And this, according to this person, it goes on a little bit longer to say, this happens almost every night.
So I'm just going to repeat this. So what should you do if you wake up in the middle of the night and can't return to sleep? And this is something we see very commonly. This is a very common presentation of insomnia. And even if you don't have a clinical diagnosis of insomnia, many of us can suffer from this experience frequently. So the first thing is that I'm going to throw out there is to look for a cause of the awakenings. Is there something particularly for our individuals that say 3:24 every morning I'm up? Is there a train going by, a pet that's bothering you, a child, etc.? The other thing is that there are sleep disorders that can cause arousals at night, the most common one being obstructive sleep apnea. So if your airway obstructs during sleep, your lungs don't fill with air, your oxygen levels drop, and so your brain wakes up to resume ventilation. And what we see in obstructive sleep apnea, it's most common in our stage REM sleep or our dream sleep. And you guys are all circadian experts now, and we know that our REM sleep is circadian gated, so it's most common in the early morning hours. So if you have any signs of obstructive sleep apnea, snoring, choking, gasping, daytime sleepiness, that could be a reason that you wake up in the middle of the night. So that's getting to the root cause. But what do you do regardless of the cause if you can't get back to sleep? So we commonly hear, well, of course I'm going to lay in bed because I don't want to get riled up. I've got a big day tomorrow. I need to get my sleep. So many people will remain in bed and toss and turn with the hopes that sleep will come. And the first sleep elective I ever did, which was someone very prominent in the field, he told me falling asleep is like falling in love. You can't force it. And we find that when people lay in bed attempting sleep, it's just like Pavlov's dog. They start to form an association with the bed and wakefulness. We call this conditioned arousal. So the best thing you can do is if you're in bed, either at the beginning of the night or during this 1 a.m. Awakening, like our viewer suggested, is to leave the bedroom. Now, we all just learned about the effect of light at night on sleep. So what you want to do when you wake up is not get on your computer, not get on your tablet. We even would suggest you avoid the TV, but we recommend people do something relaxing in dim light until they feel drowsy again and then can return to sleep. And this is something called stimulus control. This has been around for ages. This is a proven technique, even though it seems paradoxical, in treating insomnia.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. I learned a little bit there for sure. Dr. Allada, is there really a connection? I mentioned this a little bit, but several questions have come up about this lack of sleep and dementia. And then also, if you could also talk about lack of sleep and performance. So both dementia and then everyday performance.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And unfortunately, the answer to the lack of sleep and dementia is yes, but please don't stay up tonight worrying about it. Um, so, but yeah, there's been really kind of been an association between getting older and having poorer sleep, more fragmented sleep. I think like the last question, you kind of heard that that's more common as you get older. I have that problem myself getting up, and so I appreciated Cathy's advice on that. But there's now an increasing body of evidence in the science really looking at, I'll focus a little bit on Alzheimer's disease, which I talked a little bit previously, but there's a tremendous body of evidence suggesting that not only is poor sleep just associated with Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's dementia, but that the poor sleep may actually be contributing to the disease. So we know sleep is important for things like memory consolidation, but sleep is also important, seems to be important for perhaps clearing out
in helping protect your brain from the toxins that accumulate during Alzheimer's disease. So it's a real thing, and I think to flip that coin a little bit sounds a little threatening about poor sleep. I think it's also an opportunity, right? So the fact that we're gaining this understanding, I think, is really going to open up potential new therapeutic avenues for addressing these devastating diseases and dementias more broadly. So I really feel like as the institute director, I feel like this is definitely an area where Michigan can really make a major contribution.
So maybe I'll then ask Cathy, or Dr. Goldstein, excuse me, ask Dr. Goldstein a couple of kind of rubber hit the road questions. So what do you recommend in terms of hours of sleep then, to follow up on what Dr. Allada has just said? And again, can you correlate? Is there any correlation between the numbers of hours someone has slept and their performance, their ability, both mental, there's also a question about physical or athletic performance?
Absolutely. This is a great question. So for most adults, somewhere between 7 to 9 hours. Most people are going to fall within the 7 to 8 hours. Like anything in nature, there's a bell curve. So we do have people that fall on that lesser end and that fall on that higher end. Now, that being said, people always assume that they can perform optimally on less sleep than they actually need. And this is very well known. They've studied this when people are chronically sleep deprived, which is many of us, right? And that's that not pulling an all-nighter, but getting 6 to 7 hours of sleep every single night. People don't recognize their deficit. And then when we let them stay in bed for 9, 10 hours as part of an experimental protocol, over time, eventually that deficit will decrease. And we know that sleep extension can improve not only that mental performance, right? So your attention, memory, but also physical performance. And there was a great research project at Stanford where they took their basketball players and had them stay in bed 9 hours a night. Most of that was sleep. They had marked improvements, particularly in their free throw shots and also their scoring. And there's a lot of really interesting things with physical performance in sleep. So even though we typically say vague things like recovery, it's restoring, but sleep is actually when your growth hormone is secreted, right? So if you're not getting slow wave sleep, you may not have an appropriate surge in growth hormone. The other thing that sleep can do is that when you're sleep deprived, and whether you're a pro athlete, a weekend warrior, just an exerciser, sleep deprivation increases your perceived exertion. And this is so true. You can think about this in your morning workout tomorrow. If you've had a bad night of sleep or have been sleep deprived, that same workout feels a lot harder. And that's probably one of the biggest ways that sleep impairs physical performance.
That's again, fascinating. And so, Dr. Allada, what changes occur in the nervous system when someone falls asleep? Or wakes up, and then what about dreams? So there's many questions about dreams. So can you talk to me about sleep and dreams?
Sure. Well, in terms of like more broadly, what happens when we fall asleep, the sort of classically, we learned a lot of this from really really classic studies measuring the overall brain activity. So we know that the brain's electrical states and activity changes dramatically as we go through different stages of sleep. The deepest stage of sleep, which is thought to be the most restorative, called slow wave sleep, where you have the synchronous activity of activities in your cerebral cortex occurring with a certain frequency. And then during REM sleep, which is dream sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, we know that essentially what you have is the brain is in roughly an awake activity pattern, but your body is paralyzed. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this part of sleep, which getting back to Cathy's talking about what happens when you only get 6 hours of sleep, that REM sleep tends to happen in that last 2 hours towards the end. And so one of the things we think REM sleep is important for is helping you do a process your kind of emotional states. And so emotional processing and how you deal with, like, emotionally deal with, your life, which is obviously a very big issue these days. And also, I just want to add, in terms of that's sort of the electrical side of things, and that's where the dream sleep comes in.
Uh-huh.
But we're learning a lot about things like changes, your body resets the synaptic connections in your brain. It helps with memory consolidation is happening during sleep. And as I sort of alluded to a little bit with just talking about Alzheimer's, there's a lot of evidence that the brain is sort of cleaning itself up. I call it brainwashing, where the fluid flow in the brain is changing, such as helping clear out, if you will, some of the, if you will, quote unquote, garbage that's accumulating during the day. And this may help us defend against, things like neurodegenerative diseases. So a lot of things happening during sleep.
Interesting. So our time is up, but I think I'm just going to go over a few minutes because we really have so many interesting questions. This was asked 4 different times, Dr. Goldstein. How does alcohol consumption affect sleep? And if it does, can you give some recommendations about quantity and time of day?
Okay.
Okay.
So here's the bad news.
Okay.
So unfortunately, alcohol has a profound effect on sleep. And there is a very old study, I call it the not so happy hour study, where they gave men it was the equivalent of about 3 drinks, I believe, but it was around 6 hours before bedtime. So it wasn't close to bedtime. These individuals were sober when they went to bed. But unfortunately, when you compare these gentlemen to the individuals who received mineral water, they had twice the amount of wakefulness in the latter portion of the night from alcohol. And so we think what's happening, it's not acute intoxication, but it is some withdrawal effect that is resulting in that increased wakefulness in the latter part of the night. So the first thing I tell my patients who have difficulty staying asleep, returning to sleep, or awakening earlier than desired is to cut out the alcohol. Cut it out for 4 weeks, do one of these dry months. If it really doesn't make a difference, you might introduce it back slowly, but there's a lot of health benefits of cutting back on alcohol in general. And we just see that some people, they seem to do fine. It doesn't bother them, their sleep. Other people, 1 glass of wine, and that's it. They're up at 3 in the morning. So I really recommend complete cessation if you're having problematic sleep maintenance insomnia. You can't stay asleep.
You're right. Probably not a very, what should I say, popular answer, but a very practical answer.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions following up on that to you, because there were several questions about alcohol. Someone wanted to know, is there a difference between 1 glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine, 3 glasses of wine? So is there a dose-dependent effect on alcohol and sleep, or is it just complete cessation?
So I think that dose dependency is very difficult because people have different tolerance levels in general. And again, it seems to be the effect can be there even with small amounts and even when you're not acutely intoxicated. So if it's a question, I'd recommend going to, this is great. You can do N of 1 studies with yourself. And in the end, as we focus more on precision medicine, this becomes more important. Everyone really is going to have a different impact. So, and the only way to know is to stop.
Okay, well, thank you. And because our hour is getting late, I'll ask the last question to Dr. Allada, although, and then I'll thank our panels because it's been a fascinating discussion. Several individuals have asked something along this line. What are the possible causes of only sleeping in short increments? Now, we've talked about being awake, but these are people who say they sleep in like 3-hour increments, and because of CPAP or maybe because they have to get up and use the restroom, they are awakened. They can go back to sleep. So the question is, does that hurt you in terms of your mentation, your ability to perform, or is it just like you are getting continuous sleep, but you are constantly being interrupted every 3 hours?
Sure. Yeah, and I think let me take that in a couple of parts here. So one of the interesting things about sleep, if you go like look out on the animal kingdoms, sorry to move out of the humans here for a bit, but it's actually pretty common for animals to sleep not in like one bout of 8 hours. And in fact, I think sometimes people have the impression that if they're not sleeping that full in
Right.
continuing with 8 hours, obviously we know there are some societies, cultures where they might sleep a little bit during the day and maybe a little bit less at night, things like that. So there's a lot of like some flexibility to that. And as long as I think we're getting at least the amount of sleep, I think that's going to get you a good part of the way there. One of the things we know, getting back to this 3 hour number that you used, is that we actually cycle in the middle of the night during our sleep. I talked about the slow wave sleep and the non-REM sleep and the REM sleep, the dream sleep. We actually cycle between these stages of sleep every 90 minutes. So every 90 minutes, we actually are relatively easily arousable, easy to wake up, right? And so that 3 hour number kind of makes sense, right? Because that's just like two 90-minute cycles. And so, we're constantly going through this, and sometimes we might wake up a little bit. As long as we're able to get back to sleep, I think you're probably doing pretty well. And I'll just say probably a little better than myself. But I think maybe Dr. Goldstein could also address this, and because she certainly deals with a lot of patients who may have similar
Yeah,
issues.
so maybe, yeah. So last word to you, Dr. Goldstein, about this idea. And I think, to be frank, this question comes, I think, from a lot of individuals, because as men age, they do usually have to get up a couple of times in the evening. And I've noticed that this question could be coming from men who are probably having to experience going to the restroom, 2 or 3 times a night, but able to get back to sleep immediately.
Yep. So we would say 1 to 3 awakenings. And when I say awakenings, I mean awakenings that you're cognizant of, not what your wearable tells you, which is a different story, are considered normal as long as you can fall back to sleep. However, if you're so Dr. Allada talked about, it's really this total number of hours we think that's going to impact your daytime function. So if you find that you're getting 8 hours of sleep in total, and it's fragmented, and you have a lot of daytime consequences, you're not thinking clearly, you're sleepy, your mood is poor, it's probably not just that you're having the awakenings at night. It's probably because there's a cause of the awakenings at night that is known to impact daytime function. And the most likely cause there is sleep apnea. And one of the biggest presenting signs of sleep apnea is nocturia, or having to get up to use the bathroom at night, because there are changes in the in the chest cavity due to obstructive sleep apnea that result in people needing to excrete urine at night. So that's always one of my biggest clues. And the first thing I hear when people are optimally treated with CPAP is, I was waking up like 8 times a night, now it's 1. Even people have a bad prostate who are on medications for their bladder, the CPAP still helps. So if that's going on,
Excellent.
please get your sleep apnea addressed.
Excellent. And I might have told a little fib, because I'm going to ask one more question to Goldstein, and then I promise I'll stop. You mentioned wearables. I did have many questions about wearables. Should I wear, one was, should I wear my wearable to bed? That I got a couple of times. And are the wearables accurate? Should I be listening to my wearable? So, and I know that's one of your areas of expertise. So we'll end this amazing, I think, discussion from the two of you on wearables.
Yeah, so I could talk about this for hours. This
I
is
know you can,
it's
but we'll
an
give you a
interesting
minute or
area.
two.
So what I want everyone to keep in mind, and tell your friends, tell your families, these don't monitor sleep. They monitor your pulse and your motion. And then math models these to estimate sleep. So these are a complete proxy, and they get very, very confused between resting wakefulness and sleep. So they don't tell the whole story. They also are giving us things like oxygen readings, cardiopulmonary metrics, and a lot of these things we haven't effectively compared to our gold standard. And even when we have, we're using them in the wild, they're moving around, there's a lot of room for error. So when we think about that, though, there's a lot of benefit they can have, right? And so moving from accuracy to implementation, how can we use these to help us? So if you're wearing this to bed and it's making you more anxious about your sleep, you're checking your number every morning, which those numbers, completely proprietary. We don't know if they have any meaning. They're not, there's nothing we can compare them to in science or medicine. If it's making you anxious, we need to have a divorce from the wearable during sleep. If you are going to use the wearable to change your behavior, go for it. That's how we want to see these used. You're somebody who's sleepy during the day. You're probably not devoting enough time to sleep. You want to do this N of 1 experiment where you extend your sleep time every night. It's what you're supposed to do. You're suspicious, but you're going to do that. You're going to track it on your wearable and see how you feel the next day at the end of this experiment. That's something I'd like to see people do. Also, these are great to see how different kind of behaviors impact your sleep. So for example, changes in caffeine intake, alcohol intake, and exercise programs. You can sometimes, because these watches are pretty good at measuring your heart rate variability, which is a recovery marker. These are really nice things you can do because you're looking at trends. You're looking at pre and post compared to you. But overall, keep in mind, they're not medical tools and they're of variable accuracy, particularly if we're looking at people with certain health conditions or sleep conditions.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. I think this has been so informative. I've personally enjoyed it so much. I think our participants have too. So I really want to thank both of you for joining me. And you've given us a lot. I have to do this. It's a bad pun, but right, we have a lot to sleep on now, don't we? Okay, thank you both again. Bye-bye.